Is rural India back with a bang? Well, it's been several quarters of little or no wage growth, high inflation and poor monsoons. Is all of that finally changing? Well, we're going to find out in a short while from now. ये बताइए आपकी पिछली साल फसल कैसी थी, पिछली साल बारिश कैसी थी, जब आप अपना फसल मार्केट बेचने गए आपको प्राइजेस क्या मिले, कैसा था पिछला साल आपके लिए?
पिछला साल भी इतना अच्छा नहीं था। पिछले साल भी बीच में जो अवकाली बारिश आता है, बीच में बारिश जो आता है उसमें सब फसल हमारी ख़राब हो गई थी, लेकिन दाम भी इतना अच्छा नहीं मिला जो मिलना चाहिए था, क्योंकि अब खत का रेट बहुत बढ़ गया है और उतना मार्केट में पैसा नहीं मिल रहा है। जो धान का जो सफल का जो मिलना चाहिए दाम वो नहीं मिल रहा है, और खत का औषध का जो रेट है वो ज़्यादा रेट है और उनका बीज का रेट ज़्यादा है। इसके लिए गए साल भी हमारा इतना अच्छा फसल नहीं मिला। पिछले साल भी हमारा कॉस्ट बराबर भी नहीं आया, थोड़ा नुकसान में ही था।
इस साल क्योंकि बोला जा रहा है कि बारिश पिछले साल से बेहतर रहेगी, और मतलब अभी तक आपको कैसा लग रहा है, क्या सिनेरियो है इस साल?
ये साल ठीक है, ये साल तो थोड़ा अच्छा लग रहा है। अभी कुछ बारिश भी नहीं हुआ, यहाँ पे तो नहीं हुआ, फसल भी थोड़ा अच्छा निकला है, पर लेकिन जो दाम मिलना चाहिए उतना दाम नहीं मिल रहा है। घर में हर चीज़ का ज़रूरत लगती है, किराना सामान, गैस, तो वो उसका दाम बढ़ रहा है, लेकिन हमारा जो खेती का जो है वो नहीं बढ़ रहा है। इसके लिए हम नुकसान में ही आहे.
तो मागच्या वर्षी समजा आपण खत जो डालला तर 3400 रुपयाचा खत डालल्यानंतर पीक पण कमी समजा झाला आणि भाव तर 18-19 रुपये भेटला आपल्याला. जो मजूर घेतो आपण त्याला 500 रुपये मजुरी देते, त्याच्यामध्ये आपल्याला काहीच भेटत नाही. एका तासाला एका ट्रॅक्टरला 1000 रुपये तास आहे, परवडत नाही आपल्याला. काय परवडणार आहे शेवटी 1000 रुपये तासाना? तिथं 4 तास लागायचे, 4000 रुपये वजा झाले. शेतकऱ्याला जे माणसात 500 रुपये रोज आहे त्या माणसाला, ते सगळं वजा करता करता त्याला काहीच मोबदला भेटत नाही. म्हणजे तो लॉस मध्ये आहे ना शेतकरी.
जो पिछले साल दूध के दाम काफ़ी बढ़े, तो उससे किसानों को कुछ फ़ायदा हुआ, जैसे आपको ज़्यादा दाम मिले?
नहीं वैसा तो नहीं है। खुराक देखो, भैंस का खुराक रहता है वो दिन ब दिन बढ़ता ही जा रहा है। जो हमारे कस्टमर रहते हैं वो तो बढ़ाते नहीं है, फिर महंगाई की वजह से बढ़ता नहीं है, रेट तो कम ही रहता है फिर.
Inadequate wage growth, rising prices, poor realization from crops grown locally, inequitable monsoons, untimely rains, lack of jobs, rising competition. These are just some of the factors that the villagers here are grappling with.
ना ये चिकन शॉप तो महंगा है ही है. अभी कम से कम ये बोलेगा तो 20-30 रुपया तो बढ़ गया. अभी चिकन पे 50 रुपया हो जाता है बढ़ के.
आगे जाके आपको लग रहा है थोड़ा बेहतर होने वाला है सेल?
अब देखो भाव के ऊपर, अगर भाव नीचे रहेगा तो मतलब बेहतर होगा ही. ज़्यादा बढ़ जाता तो गरीब आदमी कहाँ से खाएगा.
This year, villagers are hopeful of better monsoons, a lower rise in prices as well as better wage growth. The IMD2 forecasts the southwest monsoons to actually be above normal. But for the villagers, too much sunlight, too little sunlight, too much rainfall, too little rainfall, early rainfall, late rainfall, just about anything and everything appears to disrupt agricultural output. So, for now, it's wait and watch. What's ahead? Is a recovery in the works? Possibly. At least that's the message that's coming in from the earnings calls of FMCG companies. We're seeing a gradual recovery, according to Rohit Java, CEO and MD at HUL. Better monsoons will have an impact on the agricultural economy and therefore rural consumption. For Dabur, rural consumption grew ahead of urban for the first time in the last 3 years for the January-March quarter. That's according to Mohit Malhotra, CEO at Dabur India. The expected normal monsoon, improving macroeconomic indicators, rising government spending, lower inflation are all factors that are expected to drive demand going forward. Another instance of the recovery in rural is seen in the double-digit growth in the company's hair oil category, according to Dabur's management. The truth might lie somewhere in the middle. That's the takeaway from our chat with Pushant Sharma, director at CRISIL.
So if we look at the rural scenario, and if you look at rural income, one needs to look at three aspects of the rural income. Farm families' income comprises of income coming from cultivation, which is about 40% of the income, about 20% from livestock, a significant part of which is dairy, and another 40% coming from wages, which you spoke about. So if you look at cultivation and we take a slightly zoomed out view and we look at the last 5 years, we see that the scenario was pretty good till about the first half of fiscal 23. And that's owing to two reasons. One is that typically in a 5-year span, we see that about 2 years are seen to have poor monsoon and 3 years are normal monsoon. But the last 5, if we look at 2018 to 2022, we see that only 1 year there was deficient rainfall. So rainfall was supportive and the commodity prices shot up during the pandemic. And that was the scenario till about the first half of fiscal 23. But from the second half, we're seeing some strain in the profitability or income sentiments of the farmers. It started off with decline in prices of soybean, cotton, jute. That time in the second half of fiscal 23, the income was supported by horticulture crops. But if we look at last year, what we see is that rainfall, although statistically it just appears 6% below normal, in August we saw one of the driest Augusts in India's history, 36% below normal rainfall, and that led to a lot of impact on the productivity of crops. And while the prices increased for commodities, which we see in the inflation data, but the productivity declined, and farmers had lower amount that they could sell in the market. And that led to an impact on the profitability of the farmers. And closer now, if we look at the scenario now, we see that the summer heat has impacted vegetable as well as fruit commodities. We're seeing that there's impact of scorching. There's also impact of wilting and reduction in fruit size. So overall, if you look at the cultivation, which is about 40% of the farmer's income, we're seeing that there is strain on the farmer's income presently. The positivity that we see in the market is owing to IMD's forecast of a slightly above normal monsoon, which the market expects that it should aid the productivity of crops.
Okay, all right. Would it be fair to say that at this point, it's still a wait and watch kind of a scenario, especially considering that a lot appears to rest on the southwest monsoon trajectory, not just the fact that it could possibly be a normal monsoon, but also the variability, the equitability across geographies and across the months. Would that be sort of the correct way to look at it at this point?
That's really important what you mentioned there, because in India, if you look at our arable land, almost about half of our land depends on the rain, is rain fed, right? Only half is irrigated. So a lot depends on how the monsoon pans out. And sometimes we just tend to look at statistically over the period of June to September, how the monsoon has been. For example, last year we saw monsoon was 6% below normal, which appears almost all right because plus minus 4% is what is the acceptable range provided by IMD. But when one looks closer, one sees that July had excessive rainfall, August had a very deficient rainfall, and August is a very critical period from a vegetative growth perspective. So even now, in the period going ahead, not just how the overall monsoon season is, but the spatial and temporal distribution of monsoon will remain a very critical aspect to monitor closely.
Okay, all right. And now moving on to some specific agri commodities. At this point, Rabi collections or the Rabi harvesting has been fairly encouraging. At the same time, juxtaposed with a whole host of data that we see in inflation trends, the prices for cereals or pulses, of course, vegetables have been fairly elevated, and that's been the case for several months now. In case of pulses, for instance, the problem's been ongoing in terms of high prices for almost a whole year, maybe a little bit more. So going forward on some of these key commodities, what is the expectation in terms of prices?
Right. So, it's again a very important aspect that you bring out, that the prices have been elevated, right? So, if we speak about, say, onion, on a year-on-year basis, we see a 40% run up in prices, right? And that's, of course, on a low base. But what's very critical to note is that the Rabi onion, which accounts for about 65% of the overall annual onion production, saw a sharp decline in the sown area. So, only those farmers that were able to sow the crop, given that the reservoir levels were quite low, only they have actually benefited from the price rise. But a large number of farmers who were not able to go for the crop because of low water availability, their income sentiments have been impacted. So while the prices are up, it's not completely reflecting in the income of the farmers. Now, going ahead, what we see is that if the monsoon is normal statistically, spatial and temporal distribution is good. Some of the crops that got impacted last year, for example, paddy, maize, some of the pulses, their productivity could go up. And that could impact the prices to some extent, because if there is higher supply in the market, it could bring down the prices. And the reason why I say that is one of the most critical commodities for the Kharif season, that is paddy. There we see that the export restrictions are still in place. So if there is excess supply in the market, that will lead to a supply glut, and that could lead to low prices. But the same answer may not be for some certain other commodities. In case of, say, millets or maize, we're seeing a lot of demand from the food processing sector. We're also seeing good demand from the animal feed sector in case of maize. There we might see that the prices might actually inch up. And now coming to the horticulture crops, which have become a very critical part of the overall agriculture production. They've gained share in the overall income that they contribute to a farm family. There we see that there could be some moderation in prices, specifically for onion and tomato.
Okay, with that, it's time to slip into a very short break, but do stay tuned. We have more lined up on the other side. Hello and welcome back. You're watching an NDTV Profit special, and in conversation with me is Prashant Sharma. So Prashant, going forward, we've been talking about agri prices, how much of a pass-through we've seen so far. Going forward, what is the expectation? Tell us a little bit about what are the interventions, if any, that we can see on that front.
Right. So, like I was mentioning earlier, we are expecting that the prices for certain commodities where there are restrictions in the market, especially on export, like paddy, wheat, that could moderate the prices to some extent if the productivity is higher. In case of millets and maize, the prices could actually inch up. In case of the horticulture commodities, specifically onion and tomato, we could see certain moderation in prices. In terms of the interventions, if we look at the agriculture sector structurally, we see a lot of short-term interventions being done, whether it is to curb prices by putting curbs on exports and things like that. But certain structural measures need to be taken in order to control the volatility in prices. And of course, one has to be sure that these interventions are largely being done so that the inflation can be controlled. But if we need to structurally control the volatility, we need measures that may not yield results immediately in the next 6 or 8 months, but over maybe a couple of years. And one of those interventions is better farm gate infrastructure, which is in terms of sorting, grading, and storage infrastructure, so that when there is an excess supply in the market and the prices suddenly collapse, the farmers have the ability to store their commodities and bring into the market. Secondly, if there is a supply glut in the market, we need better processing infrastructure. If you look at the prices for tomato in February of 2023, the prices that farmers were fetching were close to about 2 to 4 rupees per kg. The same tomato was fetching about 80 rupees a kg and even surpassed 100 in some cases in July of 2023. Now, if there was better processing infrastructure for tomato, and if the tomato had been converted into a puree form, we could have arrested the price increase that we saw in the month of July. And that will enable farmers to fetch more value for the crops that they produce, and it will also protect the consumers from this sharp increase that they see in prices.
Okay, now I do want to ask you about the gap we've seen between rural wage growth and inflation. Even now, rural inflation has, for the most part, trended above urban inflation, and also the fact that rural wage growth has not kept pace for the most part historically, say going back to the last couple of years or more. What is the outlook on that, and what's been happening so far? Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So we've seen, some interesting trends on the rural wage side. If you look at Manrega, we saw that there was a sharp increase in the number of people that were requiring employment in the early part of the pandemic. That was because of the reverse migration that we saw. Ever since that, when the demand for jobs peaked in about 2020, 2021, the demand has actually been trending down. So the number of people looking for wages under Manrega has been going down. But interestingly, if we look at the wage rate growth over the last 5 years and we compare that with inflation, we see that it's trending marginally lower than inflation, the wage growth. And that is another aspect that sort of impacts the rural sentiments, and that too at the bottom of the pyramid.
Okay, all right. I do want to understand, so what the current signs that we're seeing, are they sustainable? And also, apart from the southwest monsoons, what are the other factors that we're going to have to be watching out for over the course of the next few months or for the rest of this year to determine whether the rural recovery or the early signs that we're seeing of that recovery sustains?
Right. So another critical aspect that we should sort of discuss today is the dairy and livestock part. That accounts for 1/5 of the farm family income. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen strain on the dairy segment of the rural economy. And the reason why I say that is because if you compare the growth in fodder prices with the milk procurement prices, and the milk procurement prices are the prices that farmers are fetching when they're selling the milk to the processors, the increase in the fodder price has been substantial. And that has not been sort of covered up by the increase in the milk procurement prices. And as a result of that, the dairy farmer has been worse off. Right. But given that we are expecting a normal monsoon this year, we expect the fodder prices are expected to be benign. Milk procurement prices could inch up, and that could bode well for the dairy farmer this year. But overall, if we look at the outlook on the rural income, we believe that there could be some pressure on the prices for commodities. Specifically those that have curbs on them. If the productivity of these commodities increase, there will be sort of excess available in the market as compared to last year. And hence the demand side needs to then pick up, whether it is the domestic processing segment or the export segment. That will need to support the incoming supply. Otherwise, the prices could go down and there could be pressure on the rural incomes going ahead.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll wrap up on that note. Thank you so much, Prashant, for taking time out for us. This was most insightful.
My pleasure. Thanks.
And well, on rural recovery, while there are early signs, there's clearly some more way to go. One of the key factors that we're going to be watching out for, of course, is the southwest monsoons. But beyond that, a lot more. We'll continue to bring more stories on that at NDTV Profit. Stay tuned for more.